So we've done most of our models. I'm going to create one other model, which is a cart model. So this is so that when a user is shopping and puts items in their cart, we can save them to the database even before they check out. This means that if a user, if they're logged in, if they come back to our site, those items are going to persist. Much like this is sort of how Amazon works. You can put stuff in your cart today. You don't have to check out. You can leave and come back tomorrow, and those items are still going to be in your cart. So we're going to add. That increases sales. So we're going to add one more class called the cart class. This will be a fairly simple class. We'll have an ID, a primary key. We want a product ID. So we know every time the user puts an item in their cart, we're going to record what product it is. We'll have a string for the customer ID. This field's a bit odd because if the user's logged in, we're going to know who they are. If the user is anonymous, we're going to need another way to track them, but we'll worry about that later on when we build the actual cart. We need to know the quantity. I'll put this code in the chat as well. And we'll also timestamp it. So we know when the user put the item in their cart. And we're going to have a one-to-many relationship between product and cart. One product can appear in many carts, but every cart item has one and only one product. So we've got a foreign key value here for the ID. So again, we'll say that every cart has a product. And then we'll need to go back to our product class and add a child reference. So there's our cart class. Yeah, I did. I'll explain why later, Leo. We'll actually probably just store the customer email address. I know it's not completely normalized, but it's going to be simple that way. But good question. Thank you for raising it. So here's my cart class. And then I'm just going to go back to the product class and add that child reference. So create your cart class. You can just copy and paste the properties from the chat. So in our product, we have a second child reference. That one product can appear in multiple shopping carts. So there we've got our models. I did actually kind of sketch out a bit of an ERD, a database diagram. It is on D2L. This isn't exactly what we did, but it's close. So we'll have a look. Doesn't matter that it's not exactly the same. So we've got a categories model that's has a one-to-many relationship with the products. We didn't include a field for the photo, but we can do that later. We'll show you how we change our models and then update our database. So it's actually kind of good we're missing something. And then one product can be in many carts. One product can be in many order details. And one order has many order details. If a customer buys multiple products. We'll deal with the users table later. We don't need to create a users or customers table because that comes with our identity framework. So we'll kind of leave that for a few weeks until we get into authentication. So there's our basic structure. So we've got these 5 model classes now, but our database is still empty, right? When I look at my beer store database, there's no tables here. So I'd have a few options. I could go into Management Studio and manually create all 5 of these tables with all the fields and properties and make sure I named them correctly. I had all the right data types. But we're going to let Visual Studio do that for us. So what we want to do is open up this file in data. We want to open the ApplicationDbContext, and we need to write some code here, and then we can use this code to generate the tables automatically in our database using this tool called database migrations. So we've got to set up our connection class. So in here, we're in our ApplicationDbContext, there's a few things we need to do. The first thing we need to do in this class is define our model classes. So we've got 5 models: order, cart, order detail, product, and category. So in each one of these, we're going to create a DB set of each model. And this is so basically our controllers can access the models. I will put this code in the chat as well. So I'm going to set up 5 DB sets. And then my carts. So I'll put this code in the chat. So I'm just defining 5 objects, 5 database sets. This can be used to query and save data, is what this DB set object is doing. So this is using Microsoft's data access library called the Entity Framework. We used PDO in PHP. That was our data access library. We're using Entity Framework, which is an object relationship mapper. So it maps the objects, the business classes in our project, and also models their relationships. That's what we're doing here. We've got object relationships, so we're using Entity Framework for this. So let me copy this into the chat. And this can just go anywhere inside your class definition. So here's our constructor, which Visual Studio generates. It can go above or below the constructor, doesn't matter. We don't have to touch the constructor. The one other thing we want to do here is we need to define the relationships and keys between these models. So we have several. So I'm going to start with the product and category relationship, and then we'll just sort of copy and paste it and modify it to define the other relationships. By doing this, we don't have to create the relationships and foreign keys in the database. We're going to define them in our database class instead. So our first relationship is between product and category. Oops. Bear with me for a second. I've done something wrong here. That just has to be a capital M. So when we're building our model, oh, I'm sorry. Bear with me, I'm missing a method. We need to add that's why. So this method will always need to go in our database context class. Oh, sorry. The method needs to be protected. So now we'll define the relationship. Sorry about that. So our product, we're going to say, has one category. Every product has one and only one category. And then we're going to say, and it has a foreign key and it has a constraint name. You may need to add a reference to this. So we'll create a foreign key called products category ID. Okay, sorry. Let's go. And I spelled that wrong. So this models our one-to-many relationship. I'm sorry, I apologize for the confusion. So when we're building our models, our product belongs to a category. It has a foreign key called category ID and has a constraint in the database that every product must have a category ID. So there's one of our relationships. I'll paste this method in. We're going to need to define the other relationships in here as well before we build our database. Yeah, it uses .NET always uses lambdas to provide parameters. So this is just an unnamed and anonymous parameter. So it's saying each product has a category. So it's just It's just it uses the Lambda syntax for providing parameters. Sorry, not a great explanation. I'll come up with a better explanation for next week. So there's our category. That references our category product relationship. We now need to do the same thing with the other relationships. So our product has two children, order details, and carts. So I'm going to copy that section. And the first time our entity of order detail has a product which has many order details. Our foreign key in this case is product ID. And our constraint name will be order details product ID. We're going to do the same thing with our cart and product relationship. I will put the code in the chat. Every cart item has a product. So there's our third relationship. One product, many carts. One product, many order details. And then we also have a relationship one-to-many between order and order details. So we'll need to model that one as well. So order detail also has a relationship to orders. So we've got four relationships. One category, many products. One product, many order details. One product, many carts. And one order, many order details. So I'll put the rest of it in here. So all of these go inside this model binding. So now our application understands what are the relationships between the different models. Which model is related to which other model, and what's the nature of that relationship? Which is the parent, which is the child? I'll actually push the changes up to GitHub right now as well if you need the full class. So model refs and rels in application DB context. So I'll just push that up if you need the full code here. You can grab it from GitHub. It's pushed now. So now that we've set up the models and the relationships, we're going to use this migration tool. So there's a link here that explains migrations in more detail. But basically what it allows us to do is create our model classes and set up the relationships in the models, and then copy these changes to our database using the connection string we have in appsettings.json. Okay. So if I run these commands, add a migration and update the database, our database is going to be updated. It's going to build the tables based on the structure of our models and the relationships we've defined here. So this is one way of auto-generating the code. We don't have to do this. You'd be free to go into Visual Studio and build all the tables and keys manually. If you want, you can. There is also the option to build the database first and generate the models in the reverse order. And I put in a link. If you watch the video from last year's class, I did it that way. But primarily now Microsoft is recommending this code first model. Build your models and then sync them to the database. So here's how that tool works. If you click on Tools, and this is in the slides as well. So if you click on Tools in Visual Studio and go to New Get Package Manager, I'm going to open the Package Manager console. This is basically a PowerShell window. So what I'm going to do is I want to add a migration is the command. Add dash migration, no spaces. It's not case sensitive. And I'm going to call my migration create initial tables with no spaces. Yep. Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager console. So this is like a Visual Studio command window using Windows PowerShell. So in here, I've typed the command you see at the very bottom of the PowerShell window, add dash migration, and then I've given it a name. It's description of what changes are we going to make to the database. I'm going to create the initial tables. So I'm going to hit enter. And what Visual Studio is going to do, it's going to write an SQL script to execute in the database. So notice here in Solution Explorer, it now created a CS file called create initial tables, and it's got the SQL translation from our model. It's going to drop the tables and then create these tables. So I'm going to go back to my Package Manager console. We haven't executed yet. To execute this, we run the command update database. This is going to run this SQL script in our database. So anytime we change our model, we make a new migration and update the database. It says it's done. So now if I go and look in my local database, if I click refresh and expand my tables, we now have a whole bunch of tables. Notice we've got a cart table, categories, order details, orders, and products. So it takes our model names and pluralizes them. So here's the cart table. It's got columns that match the definition in our model. With ID, it's got a foreign key. If we look at the orders table, same thing. Here's all the columns. Now you may be wondering, what are all these tables that start with ASP.NET? These tables are all generated by the identity libraries that got included when we created the project. When we chose individual user accounts and we update our database, well, it automatically generates a users table. So Leo, here's why our customer ID is going to be a string, because in this table, it actually uses a string for the ID. We'll look at that in more detail later. It's got a roles table where we can set up different roles like admin, customer, supplier. Okay. So I ran the two commands that you see here. I'll highlight them. So in the Package Manager console, you type add dash migration, and then you have to run update database. Update database executes the migration. So we're going to do another migration. we want to modify one of our tables. Okay. So in our product table, our product model, one thing we didn't include was a property for a photo. Maybe we want to be able to upload a logo of the beer. So we're going to modify the model and then we'll run a new migration. We don't have to drop everything. It's just going to update the database. So we could manually change the model and manually change the database, but the simpler way is change the model and then run a new migration to update the database. So under volume, I'm going to add a new string property called photo, where we could store the path or the name of a product photo. I don't want to store the file itself in the database. I just want to store the image name. So add a new string property to product. And then I'm going to go back to my package manager console. I'm going to add a new migration. I'll call it add product photo. So it's kind of like a git commit message. I'm describing the change we're making in the database. So I'm adding that property. And now I run update-database again. And Visual Studio should update my product table. If I hit refresh in my Object Explorer and expand the products table, we now have a new property at the bottom called photo. So again, you could do this if you wanted to. You could just update your database manually. But the migrations make sure that everything is named consistently. So I've just added the two commands I ran in the package manager console. So if the migrations, if you're not comfortable with them, you can do all the work manually and repeat the changes in your model and in your database. But the migrations, the point of them is that you don't have to. So a lot of the work in planning your application really just comes in figuring out what models do you need, what properties go in each model, and what relationships are there. You create the models, and then you need to define those models and their relationships in you'll need this method. So you'll have to create this method in your assignment, this on model creating. It's not there by default. Visual Studio writes most of the code, but it doesn't write this method. So you need this method and you need to define the one-to-many and the keys. So now we're going to try the code generation tools. Setting up the models is a fair bit of work, but we only have to do that one time at the beginning. So now what I want to do is create a new controller, but this time we're going to use the Visual Studio tools to build our controller and our views for us. So I'm going to right-click my controllers. I'm going to click Add Controller. We're not going to pick an empty controller this time. We want this third option, MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. And the description says, an MVC controller with actions and razor views to create, read, update, delete, and list entries from an Entity Framework data context. So that's using our ApplicationDbContext class. So pick this third option, MVC controller with views using Entity Framework, and click Add. So now it's asking, what model do we want? Let's pick our category model. It says, what is our data class or data object? That's our ApplicationDbContext. And if I pick the category model, notice Visual Studio automatically names it correctly. It names it categories controller. And if use a layout page, if this isn't pointing to your shared layout, you can just browse to it here. Under views and shared, we'll pick our layout. So this is going to generate 5 views and a whole bunch of methods for doing create, read, update, and delete. So I'll show you that again. I'll go through it one more time. Right-click controllers, add controller. Pick MVC controllers with views using Entity Framework. We'll pick our category model, and we only have one data context class. We'll reference our layout page and we'll keep the name as categories controller. Let's click add. So Visual Studio is going to take a minute. It's going to generate the controller, and it's going to generate a series of views. We're almost done for today. If you're on a Mac, the option is slightly different. I believe you choose Add New Scaffold, and then you have the option to create a controller with views. So it creates a categories controller. It uses our database connection object. It just calls it _context. We've got a constructor. So whenever you instantiate our categories controller, the controller requires an instance of our database connection. And then we have a bunch of methods here. We've got an index method that lists the categories. A details method that accepts an ID parameter and returns the selected category. We have methods for creating, editing, and deleting. So in your assignment, you don't have to write much code. Most of the code you're writing is just creating the models and the relationships in your database. So let's see how this works. I'm going to build my project. And we should now have working pages that will allow us to add, edit, and delete categories. Excuse me. So in my project, I'm just going to go to localhost / categories. And I get a working index view. There's no categories in the database. Let's try to create a new category. So I'll click Create New. Notice the form that gets created, it doesn't have the ID because the ID is a keyword. Entity Framework, it knows that's going to be assigned by the database automatically. So let's add a few categories in the beer store. What's one category of beer we might sell? Okay, let's add stout. When I click create, saves to the database. How can we be sure? If I go in and right click my my categories table, in Management Studio, I select 1000 categories. It writes the query, ID number 1, name of stout. Let's put a few more categories in here. What other types of beer might we sell in the beer store? Yes, it's very cool. So let's add maybe somewhere between 3 to 5 categories. What other kinds of beer do you like to drink? Okay, we'll add IPA. Okay, Leo, you got 1 vote, somebody else. That's not a category, Sky. Come on. Okay. We might as well spell it right. You can put any categories you want in there. Okay. And let's say I spell something wrong, right? It saves it. I also have a working view to edit. If I click edit, brings up the view. If I want to delete, it says, are you sure? I delete and it's gone. So this is largely what you need to do for your assignment. Based on the application you've decided to build, you've got to create the models like we did here. There needs to be, you only need a minimum of 2 models. You don't need 10 models. You need 2 at minimum. The 2 models you create, there has to be at least one one-to-many relationship that will be referenced this way, like we did between, say, order detail and order. And then in your database class, you'll need to declare your models and include the relationship. And then you can use these migration commands. They're in the slides for you to reference to build the tables in your database. If you want to build the tables manually in SQL Server, that's fine. But the ID fields, they should be auto-generated. Users shouldn't be entering any primary key values. Okay. I'm going to scaffold one more controller and then we're going to call it a day. I'm not going to deploy this to Azure today. We'll do that next week. But I want to show you how the relationships work. So let's create a product. Let's scaffold a product controller in views as well. So I'm going to right-click controllers and repeat the process. I'm going to click Add Controller, pick MVC controller with views. This time I'm going to pick the product model. I don't need to make any other changes. Everything else just defaults. It uses the only DbContext class we have. It uses the only layout page we have. It names it Products Controller. So now I'm going to click Add. It's going to scaffold a new controller. With a new set of views. You'll notice we now have the categories folder. So now in views, we've got categories and products. So this time, if I go to my products index view, it's going to query the database, the list of products, which we don't have any yet. But we'll add one product and we can see how the relationship works. So you notice because our product model has a category reference, it's already set up to model that. So let's add one product. And when I click Create New, the scaffold already gives us a drop down of the parents. So we don't have to write a join. We don't have to write a query to fill this drop down. Because we've said our product model. So Leo, this is why we needed this object reference. You had asked, well, do we really need the foreign key and this reference? The reason we do, the foreign key is so the migration will store the value in the database, and this reference is basically for the views. So let's add one. We can create a SKU here. I'll create a stout. Let's say, I don't know, a 6-pack of Guinness. I don't know, maybe $14.95. Volume 500 milliliters, and we'll leave the photo blank. So now when I create the product, it actually shows me the category name automatically. So this saves us lots of work in our user interface. Obviously, this isn't a production-ready application. We're going to have to do a lot to tweak it and clean it up. But this is a great way to start and get our data entered in the database. And then we can make whatever changes we need to the views in order to present the data in the way we want to. I know that was a lot for today. But these are all the things you guys need to know in order to be able to work on your assignment. So I'm going to push my code up to GitHub. Next week, we'll look at how do we deploy the website to Azure. And then how do we start customizing this and making it look less like a scaffolded application and more like a real application in terms of both how it looks and how it functions. Okay, so I'm going to push the code up to GitHub. Thank you for your patience and sticking with me today. I'll upload the video. If you have questions or need help, then I do have office hours appointments available on Thursday. Other than that, you can get to work on your assignments and have a great week. I'll see you guys next week.